This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Iceland and Fukushima Devil Fish. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys who enjoy talking about manga. And on this month's episode, we're going to be looking at two relatively recent titles. We're going to begin with Yuichi Yokoyama's Iceland. And then after that, we're going to look at Fukushima Devil Fish by Susumu Katsumata. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that go higher than that.
Like this month, you can get volumes of Rurouni Kenshin for 30% off and volumes of Akira for 25% off.
Yeah, and we love Akira.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, one of the earliest manga titles that we discussed in our monthly manga series. But whether you like your comics in either Asian or Western formats, it doesn't matter because you're going to get great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Well, Shea, here we are with another manga episode. And if you recall, on our last show, we shared several correspondences that we had received over that previous month. Well, I'm happy to say that the fun just keeps happening because we've gotten a bit more correspondence since our last episode.
Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
The first two messages that I want to share with everyone came from YouTube. And you know, Shea, I've mentioned on other episodes of the Comics Alternative podcast that we are getting more and more correspondences via YouTube, which I find interesting because we don't have as many followers on our YouTube channel as we do people subscribing to the podcast. But those who do listen to the show via our YouTube channel, I think, are more apt to leave us commentary. So that's good.
Yeah, it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality.
Exactly. And if people want to listen to an audio podcast via a video platform, that's fine with us. But the first comment that we got about last month's show is from someone that actually we've heard from before, David Weinbinga, and he wanted to express his appreciation for our discussion of Red Colored Elegy, and he commented that it was nice to hear a discussion on Gakiga. So thank you, David, for that comment, and in fact, if you like discussion on Gakiga, then you'll love this episode. We also got a comment via YouTube from Antabolic is the person's name on there. And he wrote, or she, who knows, great show, guys. You deserve more subscribers. Hopefully more people will discover this channel soon. And I agree with him. I would like for more people to discover that channel.
I also agree.
Yeah. But, you know, then we got an email from Zach Schweitzer, and he wrote, I gotta say that your podcast on Battle Angel Alita Deluxe Edition finally got me to read the original manga. Many years ago, I watched the film as a kid, which a friend had bought on a had bought at a Suncoast. And he says, wow, that was a long time ago. I guess that's a shop, a store.
Yes, I remember Suncoast videos, and it was quite a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, he said he watched it, but he didn't care much for it back then. He goes on, years later, I ran into the sequel manga, Battle Angel Alita, Last Order, and I enjoyed it a lot. And while I missed some of the backstories, I felt I didn't really need much of it since I was able to follow the plot of the new series rather well, even without reading the original series. It wasn't until your discussion that I said, well, I really should go back and fill in the gaps. So I did and got the whole series. It was a super enjoyable series as a whole, and obviously makes the sequel easier to understand, but I was also amazed to see, in the extra material of the last volume, the prototype for what would later be Battle Angel Alita, Last Order, a prototype that was rushed to begin with due to Yukito Kishiro's failing health at the time. It wasn't until he finally recovered that he was able to properly develop the sequel he intended to create. So yeah, that's the story of how you guys got me to read even more manga. Zach, thanks.
Well, that is good to hear. Yeah.
So that's wonderful that our show is helping Zach, and we hope others read more manga, because that's why we're here, right, Shea?
Yes, we love it, and we want you listeners to love it.
Mm-hmm. We do. And we also want to hear from you, so please correspond with us, whether it be via email or YouTube or Twitter or whatever means. Carrier pigeon, that would be fine. Shea, you want to get into a discussion of this month's texts?
Yes, let's get into the wild world of Yuichi Yokoyama.
Yes, and his latest book, Iceland, came out in August of last year from Retrofit Big Planet, one of our favorite publishers on the Comics Alternative. And this is something that, you know, both you and I got a copy of, and I think loosely we had intended to discuss it on a manga episode sooner rather than later, but we never got around to it. But we wanted to do it this month because we thought it would pair rather well with the other book that we're looking at.
Yes, they are both they're both fine examples of the kinds of comics we love, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, you were familiar with Yokoyama's work previous to this, right?
Yeah, I was really excited when this originally got announced because it's usually several years between new translations of Yokoyama's material, and I am a big fan. What about you? Was this the first book of his you had read, or were you familiar with his work before?
Well, I was familiar with some of his work, not that I read all of his work. I read World Map Room, which came out in English in 2013 from Picture Box, which had been his publisher. Picture Box is no longer around. And I have copies of some of his other books, like New Engineering, Travel, and Garden, but I just haven't read them yet. But in terms of looking at them, I mean, visually, they're of a kind with what we're going to discuss today with Iceland. What about you? What other works of his had you read?
I had read, like you had read World Map Room, and I think that was the first time that I had ever encountered his work. And I think since then I had gone back and read either Garden or Travel. I can't recall which, but it was one of those two.
Yeah, and Travel primarily takes place on a train, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think that whole thing takes place on a train, if I'm remembering correctly.
Well, one of the things so you've read World Map Room.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that Yokoyama mentions at the very back in the notes section of that book, World Map Room, that World Map Room was the first of what he is conceiving of as kind of a series of text. And he says he was going to be tentatively calling these, Flower Garden, Frozen Sea Part, and Overtake.
Yes, but obviously the title for that second book changed a little bit in the intervening years.
Yeah, so now we have Iceland, which is significantly shorter than World Map Room, and he even mentions in the back of Iceland that this is the sequel to World Map Room. And although it, in terms of page count, is shorter than World Map Room, in many ways, the narrative experience, right? What at least for me, what I came away with in Iceland was about the same as what I came away with, what I can remember with World Map Room.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the case for me as well. And I think it gives us a good opportunity to really get into the book. And, so when you're talking about, narrative or story, did you want to take a stab at describing maybe the, what passes for a plot in this one?
Well, it's called Iceland, but as the author tells us in the back of the book, it doesn't necessarily take place in the nation Iceland, but it's in a setting where there's a lot of ice. It's very cold. The characters are talking about how cold it is. And it begins with two characters, and they're looking for someone. It's kind of like they're detectives, but we don't know if they're detectives or not. We don't even know why they're searching for this guy. They find this person, and then they go with this person into a building that, as they describe, seems to be a little too big for the setting, for the location. This seems to be, I don't know, from what I can gather, like a game room, because they go in and someone is playing a game. It's very loud. They really can't hear themselves. Our protagonists can't really hear much of what's going on. And then actually they find the person after going inside the game room. That's right. And then they come out, they find the guy, and then they go with this person into a taxi, and then they leave. And that's basically the plot. That's what goes on in Iceland. Am I forgetting something?
No, I think that about sums it up. I mean, would you believe it if I told you that Yokoyama claims to have never read a comic before?
I guess it does surprise me.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because, are you suggesting that because he's never read a comic that the importance of plot is something that he really didn't pick up on?
I mean, from the few interviews of his I've read, that seems to be the case. He really has no interest in reading other people's, and he only makes them himself because it's the best way to kind of realize his project of drawing time.
Yeah, well, he's not only a mangaka, but he is also an artist, kind of in a broader sense, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that makes sense. But you can understand the significance of plot by experiencing narrative in other forms, right? Not just manga or comics. I mean, he can watch film, TV shows, read stories, novels. So I don't know. I'm curious about his. I'd be curious in reading about his views on plot or story and what makes up a story. And I tell you, in reading Yokoyama, and I felt this way with World Map Room, I definitely feel this way with Iceland, I couldn't help but be reminded of Samuel Beckett. Because with Beckett, and most people may know Beckett for his play Waiting for Godot. A lot of other drama of Beckett is this way as well, but also his fiction. There are things that happen, but they happen almost in the abstract. And many times when you have characters doing something like, famously Waiting for Godot, you don't know what the motivation is. You don't know what the end result is. In other words, you get characters who are doing things or who are in certain situations that have no explanation, don't seem to make much sense. But that's the story that we get.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about Beckett, but I think in terms of narrative, that's a really interesting comparison. when I think of Yokoyama, I think of something more like the brothers Quay, who do these like strange, very opaque short films that are seem to be more interested in like atmosphere and ambiance than in narrative per se. But the Beckett comparison, like I said, is I think in some ways a very apt one that hadn't occurred to me.
I think what you were describing, the emphasis on ambiance or mood over plot, makes a lot of sense, because I think that's one of the things I take away from Yokoyama's work. Another thing that strikes me about his style is that, for me, it's very claustrophobic. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is his paneling, we get images where the subject matter seems right up in our faces, and sometimes that seems to be the case almost literally, where we will have a close-up of a particular character. But at other times, it's not as if we have a figure or an object right up in front of us. And it would be comparable to taking an image, such as a photograph or an illustration, and holding it very close to your face, mm-hmm. to where you really couldn't take in the entire picture, mm-hmm. but you only get parts of it. That's what I mean by this claustrophobic feeling. But even when you do have in many of his panels a figure or some kind of image that is not a close-up, the way that he handles patterns and even sound effects, the Japanese mm-hmm. letters.
Yeah.
Which, are translated into smaller English for us, but the way that they're written out in Japanese are rather large, and mm-hmm. it consumes much of these panels. And so that's another example of this claustrophobia effect, for me at least. Mm-hmm. And at times it's difficult to understand what's going on, again, on the level of plot. But that's okay, because, even without this claustrophobic feeling that I'm trying to describe, there's not much going on anyhow in terms of the story. Mm-hmm. So, I'm fascinated by how Yokoyama tells or reveals story or some kind of movement, whether it be a movement in events or literal movement, characters going from one place to the next, or interacting or even speaking, and how that is visually handled in his manga.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are a couple things there that you mentioned that I think are worth kind of picking up on, that I totally agree with. I think claustrophobia is a good way to describe, like you mentioned, those panels, those extreme close-ups where this focus on a single detail or a character's face, but it's so focused that it kind of loses enough of the detail or the context to be able to make sense of what you're looking at. And I think that, and you mentioned the sound effects, the size of the sound effects, and the way characters are, or the way Yokoyama tends to render movement. And I think all of these things are very much a part of this project of his that I mentioned earlier, which is his kind of attempt to explore space and time, and how do you render that, and what does that look like, and what does the experience of that look like? And I think you some of the things you were talking about is I definitely pick up on as well, because that's the aspect of Yokoyama's work that I'm most attracted of, this interrogation of space in a way that's really, really interesting, but at times, like you mentioned, can make it very difficult to tell what is going on, who certain figures are. I in Yokoyama's comics even have there are characters, let's say, there's these individuals that you can distinguish based on their unusual looking faces, but through the number of comics of Yokoyama's I've read, I've always had a difficult time keeping track of these characters because of some of those qualities that you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Another thing that what Iceland or Yokoyama's work reminds me of is futurism. And if listeners aren't familiar with futurism, it was kind of a social, definitely an art movement in the early part of the 20th century. I think it originated in Italy, and it seemed to emphasize the new, the modern, speed, technology, motion, even violence. And a lot of futuristic paintings seem to capture a figure or an object in movement. And it's similar to the effect, to some degree, of taking a photograph with a slow shutter speed and you get a blur. And the way that it is visually represented in terms of movement, speed, and even violence in futuristic art is almost as a repetition of an image, or at least a portion or pattern of an image across the canvas. And there are a variety of instances in Iceland and in Yokoyama's work in general where it has that effect. I mean, it's not the same thing as futurism as you would find in, the early 20th century, but it reminds me of that. It, in many ways, like Yokoyama's work reminds me of Samuel Beckett in terms of narrative.
I hadn't really thought of futurism as a reference point when I read Yokoyama, but I think thinking about it now, I can definitely see the kind of thematic similarities. Though I do think what's interesting about his work is that he, like you said, like kind of the futurists, there was this emphasis on movement, on speed, on let's call it progress. But I find Yokoyama's work interesting precisely because he kind of inverts that obsession, and he's obsessed with slowing things down and stretching moments out. There are a number of scenes in Iceland and then countless others in his other books, where the simplest movements are rendered across, a full page over a number of panels, even multiple pages. So I definitely see futurism as an interesting kind of influence, if we want to call it that.
Yeah, and in preparing for this month's show, I went back and looked again at World Map Room because it had been a while. And there were a couple of scenes in World Map Room that really stood out to me in terms of, I don't know if I want to call it a futurism influence, but something that reminds me of futurism. There's one scene, if you remember, in World Map Room where the characters, and there are three guys who are the protagonists, kind of similar to Iceland in World Map Room. And in fact, these three characters look quite similar, or at least a couple do, in World Map Room to the figures we see in Iceland. And we don't know if they're the same people or not. Who knows? But there's a scene where these three figures in World Map Room are going up a long and steep stairway, and coming down in the opposite direction is a group of other individuals. And the moment where they cross paths on the stairwell seems to take forever. And you have a number of close-ups, but the way it seems to me, but even more significantly, the way that representation of two groups of people passing one another and looking at one another has that kind of almost blurred movement speed effect, but they slow it down in certain ways. So it takes place over, 2 or 3 pages. Something similar goes on later in World Map Room, where these three characters, the three protagonists, are trying to find a particular place, and we don't know exactly why, but they see one door or doorway-like thing that opens, and all of these automobiles or vehicles of some sort come rushing out. And it just goes on and on and on and on, one auto or one vehicle after another. And the way that that's represented is this sense of kind of speed or movement, but it takes place over quite a number of panels. And it just reminded me, or what you said reminded me of those scenes in World Map Room, because you said that, in addition to an emphasis on speed, Yokoyama seems to at times slow down movement in his narratives.
Yeah, I think he is, I think one of the most interesting things about the comics form is the way that an author can kind of play around with time, and the way readers experience the time of the narrative. And I think Yokoyama's work is, I think aesthetically in many ways, it's very simple. His figure work is very, it's very, very simple. But he's interesting as a cartoonist because he is really invested in these the kind of temporal quality of the form in a way that I don't think a lot of other cartoonists in Japan or in Europe or in the United States are really interested in.
And there's also a two-dimensionality to his art.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very, very flat.
And, in that sense, I said earlier that his art reminds me of futurism, but there's also something a bit cubist about his art, and especially in terms of the characters that he draws, because we see them in a two-dimensional manner, but they have... we see different facets of their bodies, especially their faces, almost in a cubist way. Mm-hmm. Although it's an absurdist cubism.
Yeah, I some of the readers can go look at some pictures from the book or flip through a copy, and they'll immediately notice the kind of strange characters' bodies are, conventional and recognizable as human, recognizable as people, but their heads, it's almost like they're all wearing these ornate, very strange masks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We forgot to mention that Ryan Holmberg does the translation of this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because Ryan Holmberg does the translation for all of my favorite weird Japanese comics.
Yeah, and he also does the translation of the next book we're going to discuss.
Yes, he does.
So this is a Ryan Holmberg-centric episode of the manga series. I would think that for people who aren't familiar with Yuichi Yokoyama's work, Iceland would be a really good introduction.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. I think, like you mentioned, it's shorter than I think the other works of his that have been translated in English, if not the shortest work of his available in English. It's one of the, and I think compared to some of the others, it has a, like you mentioned, it has some sort of shape of a plot that I think, like you said, makes it a kind of nice entry point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I guess they could turn to New Engineering, which is a collection of short stories and illustrations. Mm-hmm. That's probably not available anymore. Again, because Picturebox is no longer around. And I remember I did look not too long ago on Amazon, and some of the older books, you can get them on the secondary market via Amazon, but they're expensive.
Some of them,
because they're out of print.
Some of them are almost $100 on Amazon. I'm looking at them right now.
Yeah, because I don't have Color Engineering. I didn't get that when it came out in 2011, but I am not going to pay $90-some for it. I would like to go back and get a couple of the books of his that I've read but don't have copies of or haven't gotten a chance to read yet. But like you said, it's hard to justify $95 for a copy of one comic. Yeah. I think I got a couple of Yokoyama's books right about the time that Picturebox was going out of business. And it's been a number of years ago, but I remember getting a notification, and maybe I was on their email list, that they're about to go out of business, and they were just trying to push a lot of the material that they had in the warehouse out. And so you could get a lot of their books for relatively cheap, or inexpensive at least. And I think among those, because I got several Picturebox books, but among the ones that I got, it may have been Traveling Garden that I bought at that time.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that that Picturebox folded like it did, because for a while they were my first introduction to a pretty fair amount of the authors that we've talked about on this show. Last week we did Red Colored Elegy, and my first kind of encounter with Saichi Hayashi was at Picturebox.
Yeah.
So we lament the pipeline of good, weird manga.
Yeah. Was it Dan Nadell who did? Yeah. Who was the publisher of that? He's gone on to do other things now, but yeah. He was the force behind Picturebox. Sorely missed.
Yep.
But I wonder now if Retrofit Big Planet is going to be the publisher of Yokoyama, or at least the future manga that he's going to be coming out with in English. I hope so.
Yeah, that would be nice to see. But I am glad that Ryan Holmberg, who translated this book and like you mentioned, the next book we're going to talk about, that he's been able to find a home for a number of these projects that he was working on at Picture Box. Like I'm blanking on a bunch of them, but there's at least 4 or 5 I think that we've talked about on the show over the last couple of years that he's been involved in. So yeah, whether or not it's at Retrofit or not, I'm glad he's managed to find a home across the comics industry.
Shea, we've talked indirectly a few times about the other book that we're going to be discussing this month. So you want to go ahead and jump into that one?
Yeah, let's get into Fukushima Devil Fish, a book we have been wanting to talk about for quite a long time.
Right. This is by Susumu Katsumata, and it was published in English very recently by Breakdown Press in the UK. And this came out in late February. Shea, you and I had planned on including Fukushima Devil Fish in last month's episode because we thought that it would go really well with Red Colored Elegy. And the good people at Breakdown Press sent us a copy of Fukushima Devil Fish, but because the book was coming from the UK, it took a little longer to get to us. So unfortunately, we didn't get our copies of Fukushima Devil Fish in time, and so we substituted the first volume of Promised Neverland, which is good. I'm glad we discussed that one. But we didn't get to discuss Fukushima Devil Fish when we wanted to. Although, in many ways, I'm kind of glad that we waited until this month to focus on this, because I do think it makes a good pairing with Yokoyama's Iceland.
Yeah, I think it would have made a good pairing with Red Colored Elegy
as well.
But yeah, I think not knowing too much about Katsumata before opening this book, I didn't realize how good a pairing it would be with Yokoyama, but they ended up working very well together, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, well, first I want to, if you're listening, people at Breakdown Press, thank you very much. We appreciate you keeping us in the loop.
Yes, we do.
You do great books, and not just manga. But
yeah, they publish a ton of good stuff.
Yeah, and we've discussed a number of Breakdown Press titles in the past. But with Fukushima Devil Fish, you said that was this your first book by Katsumata?
Yeah, I actually I wasn't familiar with him at all. He wasn't like some other authors we've talked about who I'd kind of heard of and I was familiar with, but had never gotten a chance to read their work. I was going into this completely blind, but after reading this, I learned that I guess he. Drawing Quarterly a number of years ago did a collection of his stuff called Red Snow that that I guess was very well received, and so he's a kind of a biggish name in Gekiga, and I had no clue. Yeah, now I have read the stories in Red Snow. It's been a while. I had to fish out my copy and look at it again. And you're right. Drawn and Quarterly came out with the English translation of these stories in 2009. And the various stories that make up Red Snow, I guess the best way of describing them is that they're about all similar to the middle 4 stories that we get in Fukushima Devil Fish. The kind of folktale or the Tohoku inspired stories. And these are Mr. Kappa, Hanbei, the Book of Straw, and the Leaf of Sutra. But they have that kind of feel to it. It's like a pre-modern, older Japan, very rural, that is infused with mythical creatures, folktale-ish elements. And that's what primarily makes up the various stories in Red Snow. Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds like I might have to pick it up then, because those were my favorite stories in this collection, they I think for me really got at it was a display of some of my favorite kind of characteristics of Gekiga aesthetically. But I am curious what you made of the stories. I guess if you wanted to break them up into 3 sections, at the beginning you have these more kind of slice of life stories, and then you have, like you mentioned, the kind of folklore stories, and then towards the end you have more kind of I don't know how you want to describe them, opaque or oblique slice of life narratives that are akin to Yoshihiro Tatsumi stories.
Right.
Did you have a favorite kind of section, shall we say, in the collection?
Not really a favorite section, but I'm glad that you mentioned the way that the text is divided. And in fact, we could even pull back a little further to describe that this book, Fukushima Devil Fish, recently published by Breakdown Press, is divided in another way. The vast majority of it is Katsumata's work, right? The manga stories, the Gankaka. But the part, I guess, depending on how you look at the book, either in the back or in the front, are 4 essays, 2 of them by Katsumata, and 1 each that are more critical and biographical, I guess, biographical in many ways, by Mitsuhiro Asakawa and Yukihiro Abe. And the essay by Asakawa, I believe, did a really good job at grouping these stories in the ways that you just described, Shea. That what we get in Fukushima Devil Fish proper are, I think 9 stories. Now, the first 2, you called it slice of life. I don't know. I'm looking at it as as Katsumata's anti-nuclear stories. And these are the ones that are the most contemporary because they were published respectively in 1984 and then 1989. Deep sea fish and then devil fish, octopus. And then the middle 4 stories are the ones that I had referenced earlier, the kind of folktale-ish ones, the ones that seem to be inspired by where Katsumata had grown up as a kid in this rural territory, I guess the Tohoku region. And that's Mr. Kappa, Hanbei, the Book of Straw, and the Leaf of Sutra. And then the last 3 stories in Fukushima Devil Fish are described, I think Asakawa described them as I-manga. And they're much more introspective and a little harder to decipher. Those are Winter Insect, Winter Sea, and Spring Soul. Now, you were asking me which ones really stood out to me. Which stories? It's hard to say because each in their own way really stands out, especially if you look at the various groupings. I really am taken by the anti-nuclear stories, Deep Sea Fish and then Devilfish. They reminded me of something that we discussed about a year ago, Tetsuda's Ichi F, but in a very different manner. Not as, I guess, journalistic and so overt in that manner. And we do get in these stories to see how, what are they called? Nuclear gypsies, the men who work, at these nuclear power plants, how they live their lives. And so we see some of the risks and the dangers that they take, physically, but also in terms of their relationship with others and the emotional risks that are involved in this kind of work as well.
Yeah. I definitely, like you, I definitely was put in mind of EGF and if listeners are familiar with that episode, they will remember that I didn't particularly care for, I wasn't really taken with that particular account of kind of, different events, but that experience of repairing or cleaning or maintaining in various ways these nuclear reactors. So yeah, I definitely kind of preferred the more fictionalized account of of that experience. But those stories for me actually kind of fell the flattest in the collection, even though they're kind of the title stories. They didn't work for me. Like you said, they're the more contemporary ones. You know, they were published in the 80s, whereas the other ones I think were published in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. I think the more contemporary ones fell flat because they're not as artistically interesting. I think they don't offer me what what some of those later stories, those I stories, like you mentioned, that kind of conclude the book, offer, which are these really intense, really elaborate uses of ink, these really deep blues, and these really ornate images of landscapes, which I just completely fell in love with and was totally moved by it. I didn't really find that in those more contemporary stories about the nuclear gypsies. Did you see there being a kind of aesthetic difference between the more contemporary stories and the older stories as well?
Aesthetic difference in terms of the visuals or the storytelling?
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically, I'm looking at a page right now from, I can't, one of the first two stories, and I'm just looking at the ways that Susumu is drawing people in these stories. Just strikes me as being much more simplified, much more kind of conventionally cartoonish in the way he draws expressions and the way he draws facial details than in some of those earlier stories.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense to me. There is something a little more cartoonish, and not necessarily in a pejorative way, mm-hmm. With those first two stories in this collection, Deep Sea Fish and Devilfish Octopus. I don't know, because when you were asking me how I would describe any kind of difference visually, I was about to say, before you use the cartoonish description, that there's something a little more polished and to some mm-hmm. degree kind of detailed in the more contemporary, the 1980s stories, as compared or in contrast to the earlier works from the late 60s and 1970s that have a more rough-hewn look in terms of the art. And I think that roughness seems to go almost hand in hand with both, let's say, the folktale-ish aspect of several of the stories, but also the more tone-driven, impressionistic, if you will, latter stories in this collection. What's described as the I-manga mm-hmm. Stories: Winter Insect, Winter Sea, and Spring Soul. But there is something, I guess, a little more clean or polished about those 1980s stories. I like them. I don't know if I liked them less than some of the others, as you seem to have in your experience. But I was really taken by the last three in this collection. Again, the I-manga series, because I did find them more emotionally impactful, but also a little confounding. I had to go back and reread these stories, either in their entirety or just certain sections, because I felt that, at least the first time around, I wasn't really getting what I thought I should be getting from these stories. But I think that's the way that they're written. They're mm-hmm. not supposed to be a more coherent short narrative as, let's say, we get in Mr. Kappa or the Book of Straw, mm-hmm. but they're more experiences that different characters are undergoing. And in fact, the biographical critical pieces in the back by Asakawa and Abe do give some kind of context that there's mm-hmm. something going on with these latter, or the stories in the I-manga section, as they described, where Katsumata seems to be working through some issues, some very personal issues.
I think I had a kind of similar experiences. Those the folklore stories that kind of make up the middle section, I think, are the most fun to read. Because they are there are moments of kind of levity and wackiness, and some of the folklore characters like the kappa are strange and weird, and so those were a lot of fun. But like you, I think the strongest aesthetically and kind of they're I think more risky and a little more experimental, but the most ambitious and kind of artistically complex are like you mentioned, those last three. And there are some really truly extraordinary drawings of landscapes. The way you describe the more contemporary stories as polished, I would totally agree. There's but the hatching, the kind of detail and complexity and the kind of the thinness of and number of Susumu's line in some of those later stories is so he contrasts it so well with these negative spaces, and it's such a striking, really moving image. I think that kind of heightens and complements that confounding aspect that I think we're both picking up on in the narrative. Yeah.
Now, the one story, Winter Insect, is about a young man, kind of aimless. He has a job and he has what seems to be some kind of routine, but he's definitely unanchored and he doesn't seem to have much of a direction. And that's basically the gist of that story. But again, it's not a narrative that relies so much on plot or event as it does on mood and, I guess, an emotional setting would be a good way of putting it, I think.
I think I would compare the stories involving the kappa and the tanuki. I would compare the kind of Gekiga ethos or milieu that Susumu is working in those stories is very similar to the milieu that Shigeru Mizuki is working in with his Kitaro stories, whereas those the last three that we keep going back to is more similar to the kind of work being done by like Yasuhiro Tatsumi or Masahiko Matsumoto. I think that it's very concerned with the kind of quotidian, but it's a kind of oblong shaped narrative that it doesn't. You're never really quite sure what to make of it.
Another one of those I-manga stories, Winter Sea, I still don't know what exactly happens at the end, but from what I can gather in this story, it's about a young woman with a child, and we don't know much about the context, like why she has the child, what happens at the end. She sees at one point toward the beginning of the story, and then we see this person at the end as well, this other woman that seems to be a little on the mentally unstable side, who's standing by the ocean. And it's almost as if this character is like a cautionary tale. You don't want to end up like her. But again, I don't know exactly what happens at the end of that story. It's purposefully ambiguous. And then the third I-manga story, Spring Soul, is about, again, another young male character. But when the story opens, we see that this guy is talking with an older woman, but you soon learn that this older woman doesn't really exist. So is it a ghost? And I think it is. It appears to be something from the young man's imagination, perhaps. And it's very much like the other two I-manga stories, Winter Insect and Winter Sea, in that there's not much that happens, but again, it's more of a narrative that's based on an emotional setting. and a mood, and much more existential in nature.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. I think it's an interesting type of naturalism that I think presents itself as a very accurate representation of kind of the minutia of daily life, but in many ways it is this very abstract, metaphorical representation of a state of being or a mood or a particular emotion more than it is a kind of accurate representation of life. It's I think the perfect example of what when Gekiga works well. I really love about it, this very confounding or bemusing narrative married to a very striking, very complex aesthetic.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times the tone of those middle stories, right? The more folklorish ones. And you mentioned figures, the kappa and the tanuki, and our listeners may not know what those are. And in fact, I had to look them up. Now, a kappa, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of a humanoid, aquatic, reptilian kind of figure, something like a turtle or a frog. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding. And, there's a character, and I think there's 2 stories with kappa and 2 stories with, and one character, and I think the first one describes the kappa as frogs that have gotten so old that they've become human-like. And then the tanuki, I actually am not 100% sure what tanuki are. I believe they're like raccoons. Is that
well? It's another name for it is Japanese raccoon dog, from what I've seen. And so they're like raccoons, is what they are. But in folklore, the tanuki are human-like in that, I guess, similar to the kappa, they want to intermingle in the human world and even pass for human, but are usually caught as being non-human and then chased out of the community, or there's something that happens to them. And in fact, if you go, and I hope you do get the opportunity to get a copy of the Drawn In Quarterly Red Snow collection, kappa and tanuki play a big part in those stories as well.
Okay, good, because that's those the Leaf Sutra and what is the fourth? The Straw.
Book of Straw.
The Book of Straw. Yeah, I think those two were those are the 2 that feature the tanuki. I think those 2 were among my favorite. Especially the tanuki characters are a lot of fun. There's one scene, I think I think it's in the Book of Straw, where the tanuki is kind of showing a human character how to kind of turn their belly into a kind of percussive instrument. That's a lot of fun. Yeah,
that's Book of Straw. Of those middle stories, the one that deal with folklore aspects of Japanese culture, the one that really stuck out to me, I'm not going to say it's my favorite of the 4, but it's the one that I remember the most, and that is Hanbei. And this is one of those stories that deal with kappa. And the thing about this story that stands out is we get quite a bit of information about the kappa and their culture, what they do, and even, if we want to call it, their biology or even anatomy, or the transformations of their anatomy. When the story opens, and in fact, the title Hanbei comes from the name of one of the kappa that this young boy befriends. And the kappa in this story seem to be very rambunctious. They cause problems. They are disruptive figures. And so when they get in contact with human society, they cause problems. They're violent, and especially when it comes to women, they can even be violent in a sexual way. There seems to be that implication. And the young boy in this story befriends one of the kappa, Hanbei, and their relationship is based on I guess, some kind of mutual understanding. If the young boy provides Hanbei with sake that his family manufactures, then Hanbei will provide the young boy with dinosaur bones that are lodged at the bottom of this lake. And Hanbei goes down and deep dives and brings back the bones for the young boy. And he's trying to put together this, I guess, dinosaur skeleton. But the thing that gets really weird about this is this anatomical transformation, because Hanbei tells this young boy that at a certain point in the lifespan of kappa, certain kappa, so I guess they all start off as male, but at a certain point, certain kappa evolve into female kappa. And the young boy asks, well, how, which ones evolve? He says, well, usually the ones that are after the human women. And lo and behold, Hanbei is one of those who actually transforms into a female. And it's what happens when Hanbei is transformed and how that affects Hanbei, his or her, or his and her's relationship with a young boy that I find so interesting about this story.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is I think that's amongst the funniest and most kind of enjoyable of the stories. But it is also really interesting because I think you mentioned that the story gives us a lot of information about the kind of biology of kappa, but even more than that, I think it makes certain claims about the culture of kappa and their relation between sex and gender, and the way they kind of construct and impose certain gender norms. You can see as soon as Hanbei becomes a
female kappa.
As soon as he becomes female, for lack of a better term, he's immediately subordinated to some male or masculine kappa. Hanbei is expected to rear children and take care of them, and that's all he's going to do for the rest of his life. And the Hanbei's human friend, the boy that you mentioned, can't even speak with Hanbei, because Hanbei's I don't know if they ever establish what exactly the relationship is there, but the male kappa whose children Hanbei is tasked with rearing, accuses Hanbei of kind of stepping out on him a little. So yeah, there's a lot of really, really interesting things going on with kind of gender and sexuality in that story that I didn't really find in any of the stories. But yeah, it's an interesting one.
Maybe this goes hand in hand with what you were just describing. I get the feeling that of all the Katsumata that I've read, both in this collection and in Red Snow, in reading all these stories, I wouldn't use the word touching to describe Katsumata as a writer. However, mangaka. However, I do think that this story, Hanbei, is the most touching of everything that I've read from Katsumata, because I don't want to give away what happens at the very end, but what does happen at the very end strikes me as the most tender thing that we have in this collection.
Yeah, I mentioned that it's within this kind of cycle of I don't want to say kind of comedic, but a slightly lighter, a slightly more kind of jovial, slightly funner stories. But like you said, there are a number of moments in all of them, but Hanbei in particular that are really kind of, I don't want to say melodramatic, but they are kind of pathetic in a very conventional way. Pathetic as in kind of, for listeners, as in pathos. They are very kind of moving and affecting in a kind of conventionally dramatic way, which I think in itself is a little unusual for the stories in this collection.
Yeah,
but I think really effective.
And what we were just describing, let's say the end of the story Hanbei, is strikingly different from the ending of that next story, The Book of Straw, because this is one of those stories that deals with tanuki. And as you were mentioning, it's one of those that has a comedic edge to it. But where this ends up, how it ends.
Oh man, that's a really dark ending.
Yeah, it is. And again, we don't want to give anything away, but we do recommend that readers get their copy of Fukushima Devil Fish and check out what we're talking about.
Yeah, thinking about it now, thinking about Hanbei and the Book of Straw, I think there is, I think there's a lot going on narratively that, I think both of those are both really, really at their heart stories about asking really interesting questions about, in the case of Hanbei, I think gender amongst other things, and then in the Book of Straw, I think that's an example of Susumu, really grappling with this question of Japan's relationship between kind of modernity or technology or industry and nature. And so, yeah, I think it's important that listeners know that even these jovial stories are kind of these odd vehicles for really complex and really ambitious storytelling.
Another thing that we've mentioned about this particular volume that I found very valuable are the essays in the back, or the beginning. Again, depend on how you hold the book, because the manga itself reads Japanese style from right to left and what we would call from back to front. But the essays are at the other end of the book, and you read that Western style from left to right. And I'm trying to remember other books that you and I have discussed on the manga series that were published by Breakdown. Did they have similar essays in the back?
They did. What's interesting is we mentioned Ryan Holmberg translated this collection, but he didn't edit it, which is unusual because most of the books that he's involved in, he edits. And I think all of the ones that he's done that we've talked about on the show, and I believe all of the ones that he's been involved in that I've read have, usually an essay. I mean, some of the older ones that I'm thinking of the projects he worked on with Picture Box had Holmberg's a comics historian as well, and so his essays would often serve to kind of historically contextualize. But over the last few years, the stuff he's done has included, you mentioned this book includes 2 essays by Susumu, so yeah, the projects that Holmberg is usually involved in have some kind of textual component that serves to contextualize the stories included, or offer some interpretation or some author background. And like you, I always find this back matter, if we want to call it that, really, really one of my favorite parts of these projects of Holmberg.
Was there back matter in Sasaki's Ding Dong Circus? I can't remember.
If I'm remembering correctly, there was. I know there was in the new edition of Red Color Elegy that we talked about last month,
right? Which
I believe Holmberg was also involved in that new edition.
But that's a drawn-in quarterly book, though.
Yes, and then I believe there was in Ding Dong Circus, and then I don't think we talked about it on the show. I know we talked about Red Red Rock, and I believe that had some of these essays, and then an earlier Hayashi book that they published, Flowering Harbor, which I can't recall if we talked about on the show. I believe that also had some of these contextualizing essays as well.
Yeah, I think now Fantagraphics is a distributor of Breakdown Press in the U.S., and so it should be easier to get Breakdown Press books than it has in the past.
Yeah, and like we mentioned, they publish some great manga, but also some great comics that aren't manga, and we hope people pick up their stuff so that they can keep publishing new old manga.
Yep, that's right. Shea, two interesting books that we looked at for this month. We started off with Yuichi Yokoyama's Iceland, published by Retrofit Big Planet. And then we followed that with Fukushima Devil Fish, a collection of stories from Susumu Katsumata that was published recently by Breakdown Press.
I think two fantastic books. What about you?
Oh, I love both of them. So if you're not familiar with the work of Yokoyama or Katsumata, we strongly recommend that you check them out. Now, it's probably easier to find work by Katsumata than it is from Yokoyama now, just because, Picture Box, no longer publishing. But you could find the books. They'd just be expensive on the secondary market.
But if you have the money, if you have the means to spend $95 on a copy of Color Engineering, go for it.
Yeah. And if you like great manga as the kind we discussed on this month's episode, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. Every month you're going to find some incredible prices on comics, manga, and otherwise. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your manga there, get in touch with me and Shea and let us know what you thought about this month's show. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And this month, as well as every other month throughout the year, you can email the show at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me at shay@comicsalternative.com 365 days a year. And Derek, what is your email address if people want to get in touch with you?
Derek@comicsalternative.com, but only 364 days a year.
Well, let's hope our listeners don't email you on that one mystery day.
That one mystery day. You can also contact us via social media. We're on a lot of different platforms, such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. And we'd like to hear from you. We enjoy sharing listener mail or messages on our various episodes, as we did on this month's manga episode. So please feel free to get in touch with us.
Especially when you are telling people that we deserve more and more subscribers. We appreciate that an extra lot.
Yeah. And along with that, it'd be great if our dedicated listeners would share the news about the Comics Alternative with their friends. In other words, spread the love. We're all about spreading love, and I don't mean that in a weird, freaky way. Shea and I will be back next month with more manga goodness. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
Take care.